If we look at franchises on paper, perhaps none more so than Looney Tunes were primed for video games. You have a whole host of wacky characters, a zany universe, and the type of light animation and slapstick comedy which would translate extremely well into gaming formats. So it wasn't a surprise for me in 1998 that both the official Nintendo magazine and my beloved N64 magazine started noting that there was a new game in development for the console under the working name of Looney Tunes. The only surprising thing about this was that it would also be so long until we started to get much more information about this. In the year 2000, after rumoured restarts to the project, and at one point Looney Tunes Space Race being the priority game for the console, we did finally get Dodgers Starring Daffy Duck. Well, that's actually what most of you got, because here in PAL we got Daffy Duck starring Duck Dodgers, but name changes aside, it's the same game. This is a single player only experience which features built-in save slots and was aimed towards a younger gamer according to the developer. Speaking of developers, this one was developed by Paradigm Entertainment, and the pedigree of their games on Nintendo 64 is worth highlighting here. Prior to this game, their previous work on the system includes Pilotwings 64, the F1 series of games, and perhaps their highlight being Beetle Adventure Racing. They were known as a specialist vehicle-based simulation developer, and in fact Duck Dodgers was the studio's first game that didn't involve vehicles, which should set a few alarm bells ringing. So the game begins with Marvin the Martian finally finishing his weapon, which has the power to destroy Earth. The only problem is that he soon realises that he needs atoms to power it, which is a bit of an oversight because he doesn't have any. Cue Marvin sending his minions from the Looney Tunes universe to various lands in order to get the supplies he needs to complete his dream of taking over the universe. The Academy hears of what is happening, and Duck Dodgers is tasked with gathering 100 atoms before Marvin can get his hands on them, assisted only by his sidekick Cadet. I actually quite like the storyline here. The intro cinematic sets the game up perfectly well, and it fits in well with the style of the cartoon, and it does come across as something that could actually have been a genuine episode. The voice acting is also spot on, and so the first impressions you get from the game are extremely solid. Entering the first world in the game, which is Planet E, this continues with a great start to the experience. The level feels really open, and there's lots of pockets of activity taking place which really help to make the level feel alive. By the time you complete this first world, however, you'll definitely have made a decision on whether or not you like this game, as it highlights both the best features of the game and its biggest flaws. The positives certainly start with the overall presentation of the game, and I mentioned before the first great impression that the game makes, but even after completion of the game you'd be hard pushed to say anything other than positive things about the world which the studio created. Each of the planets in the game has a distinct look and feel, and also enemies to suit that particular environment. There's also some really fun mini games to play, and the platforming aspects are broken up at the right times to help keep the pacing of the game feeling fresh. It is the little details though which show that the studio really wanted to try and make this game stand out. The situation-based puzzles in the game are well thought out, and the use of classic items from the cartoon like Acme products, they're woven into the game really well. Although the rocket backpack is fiddly, it's still a lot of fun to see hurl Duck Dodgers across the screen. The death animations are also ripped straight from the show, and further personality is injected into the character by having controls to tiptoe around, and it also has perhaps some of the best swimming controls for any character on the Nintendo 64. It's the negatives though which can really hamper the game. The biggest one that almost everyone mentions are the fiddly controls. It's an understatement to say that they take some getting used to. And if you look at them on paper, they do appear very typical of any other N64 platform game, but in your hand you'll really start seeing the issues start. Now this is unusual because for a change, this game doesn't have sluggish controls, in fact it's quite the opposite. The controls are far too sensitive for a game which involves so much platforming as this game does. Trying to line up what look like simple jumps can really result in you gently massaging the analog stick trying to get Duck Dodgers to face the right direction. It seems like if you so much as breathe on the control, he'll face a completely different direction. This is further compounded by the game's camera, which, yep, you guessed it, is absolutely terrible. It has a knack of putting itself in the most awkward position, and even manually manipulating the camera slows the game down terribly, and it doesn't always help. It could be argued that the game's biggest and perhaps only challenge comes from this combination of problems. If you put in tighter jumping controls and a more refined camera system, and suddenly this would become a game which would be extremely quick to blast through. Instead, with the problems in the game, it takes around 12 hours to run through the first time you play it if you are going to go for all 100 atoms. Whilst I mentioned the fantastic presentation in the game, the graphics are a mixed bag. The art direction is a really big plus point, but the actual graphics could have done with a bit of a bump. Now, it is noted that the game as a whole looks a little soft around the edges, and this was common for many N64 platform games. But for a year 2000 release, and the game's declined implementation of the expansion pack support really makes you wish they'd have at least given you a high-res option. Saying that though, the frame rate in the game is absolutely rock solid, and it makes the game extremely playable. I don't recall a single time that I noticed slowdown in the game, and even when playing some of the mini-games or rarely used aspects like the game's FPS scene. Now, you could argue and say that a constant criticism on the N64 was fogging and slowdown in its games, and this game has neither of those, and so perhaps we're being a little bit overcritical here, and, well, maybe being a bit too hard to please. After all, the game runs solidly, and the visuals are acceptable, so let's stop being silly. The game's longevity will depend on how good you are at games in general and how you play them. If you are the type of player who goes for a 100% complete run through the game first time through, then there's not really anything to go back to once you've completed it. Without multiplayer options, and there's only 5 worlds in the game, it is very concise. The challenge comes from getting all 100 atoms, most of which are fairly accessible and don't require DGR level platforming skills to find them all. It may surprise you that I actually found the shorter length of this game to be quite refreshing. At a time when Rare were putting out games with insane amount of collectibles, and other studios were doing all they could to extend the life of their games by adding mirror modes, second adventures, alternative endings, etc., Duck Dodgers is a game that just wants you to play it, complete it, and then move on. Now sure, in the year 2000, if you paid a full price for this game, you may have felt shortchanged, as the value isn't there compared to some of the longer adventures. But for what could have been maybe a weekend rental, this was more than completable. Even now, if you're wanting to start a new N64 game and you've got limited time that's not going to suck your life away, then this is much more accessible choice than say something like Banjo-Kazooie or Donkey Kong 64. Rounding off the package comes the game's audio aspects, and the sound effects are superb and sound like they could have been ripped directly from the cartoon. The major issue I have is how often that they are used. Sure, the game's aimed at younger gamers, which I personally think is debatable, but do we really need the springing sound effect every time we jump in the game? It does become incredibly annoying after a few hours. The music too is catchy, and there's a surprisingly large amount of music in the game. Each of these sub-areas will usually have its own theme or variation of the level's main theme. Sometimes though, these can be quite short loops which are repeated over and over. And if you find a tricky section and die repeatedly, then hearing the same chords strike up time and time again can really grate on you. But I'm really interested to know what you think about this one. The Metacritic scores are all over the place, and even across the press in general, I saw reviews ranging from the 50% scores all the way up to the 80% bracket. And the most common score was somewhere around the 70% mark, which is perhaps where I too would score this game if that was something that I did. As an N64 exclusive title, do you think we got a win here, or do you think this is yet another example of a mediocre platform game on Nintendo 64? As always, thank you for watching, and until next time.